you. What you have in front of you is a map of the Cape and Islands that dates from 1775. We've all seen maps of Cape Cod that have distortions. For example, the outer part of the peninsula is straight up and down instead of the curve the way it truly is, and so on. But it was pretty difficult to find something of the 1775 period which was accurate. And we found that this map does the job. It was commissioned by the British government in 1775 to produce an accurate and up-to-date map of Cape and Islands, particularly because, of course, the British government knew that something was brewing. And so they needed to have something like this. This was drawn by a German cartographer, Blaskowitz, who was employed by the British government. There's a little bit of a distortion. The lower part of the peninsula is a little bit elongated, but on the whole, it is pretty accurate and interesting details. You can't see all the writing, but a number of the towns are named. So it had a military purpose. So moving on from that, one of the things that often comes up is the question, well, when did the American Revolution really begin? And there are various ideas about that and various opinions among historians. Obviously, of course, we can pick the date of 1775 from Lexington and Concord, or we could pick 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. But I'd like to explore some other possibilities with you. And what we'll take a look at is a quotation from John Adams with his opinion. And then I'll be interested in yours because John Adams was just one hypothesis among many others. And there are different interpretations in our book as well. So here is a slide that is just, you might say, a skeleton of the key events of the revolution with some Cape Cod insertions to show how they fit in with the general timeline. I'm going to talk about the first one, James Otis Jr. and his fiery speech in 61. We see, of course, that Cape Cod towns were involved in boycotting English tea, the closing of the Barnstable Court, which we'll talk about. And then, of course, we have Lexington and Concord. And the Cape militias were at the siege of Boston that followed that. And then 1776, we have an interesting thing that George Washington orders his army engineers to do a survey for a Cape Cod canal. Now, we know that the first proposal for a Cape Cod canal was in 1627, supposedly by Miles Standish. And then, of course, it only took 300 years to build. But in any case, it's interesting that Washington saw this as a strategic advantage to be able to cut off the extra journey that goes around the Cape in terms of safety. I'll talk about the wreck of the Somerset, a big event on Cape Cod, and also in 79, what we would perhaps call the only true battle of the revolution that happened on Cape Cod soil. And then, of course, the timeline finishes with the surrender where Cape soldiers were present, and then the Treaty of Paris 2 years later, and then the Constitution in 87. So that's just the general review of the framework that most of us already know from high school U.S. history courses. The book is divided into 4 sections, and the first covers the period 61 to 74. The second, 74 to mid-76, which of course is July 4th. Then from mid-76 to 1783, the signing of the peace treaty. And then we have a 4th section of 10 biographical studies of key people on the Cape and Islands who played roles in the revolutionary period. And when I say the revolutionary period, I'm talking about 1761 to 1783. But here is the quote from John Adams that I wanted to refer to in response to the question of when did the revolution begin? And I'd just like to read it out loud. It says, "What do we mean by the Revolutionary War? The war was no part of the revolution, but only a consequence of it." Now, just think about that for a moment. That's very unconventional by today's interpretations. The revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was an effort from 1760 to 75 before a drop of blood was shed at Lexington. It was a people's revolution involving farmers, tradesmen, and craftsmen, and we could, on Cape Cod, add fishermen, the middling classes. Now, John Adams, of course, is writing to Thomas Jefferson. We know that Adams and Jefferson were, of course, critically important in the development of the Declaration. And then they became political rivals, and they each ran for president once and won once. And they were definitely not friends. But after the War of 1812, they patched up their differences and began a correspondence that went back and forth from Quincy, Massachusetts to Charlottesville, Virginia. These two great intellectual giants were looking back on the revolution and reflecting on what it meant for the country and the country's development as a nation. And the good news is that we have all of that correspondence. It's very rich, and I have some other quotations from Adams that I'll share with you as well. So that's John Adams' opinion, that it began really in 1760. But some people say, no, it began before that. So I'd like to ask a question of those of us who are here this morning. Would anybody like to suggest even an earlier date for the beginning of revolutionary thought? You can put your answer in the chat box if you'd like. Think back to all the key dates that you know from your American history studies. Well, I'm going to throw out one that is perhaps controversial, but I think it's also educational. There are earlier dates. For example, 1733, there was a Molasses Act, which was, of course, a tax on molasses. You could go back further, but some people say, wait a moment. What about 1620 and the Mayflower Compact? Wasn't that really the beginning? And some historians say, well, in a sense it was, because there's this small group of 102 people coming and landing on a shore that they weren't supposed to be at. They had been given a charter to go to what was called Northern Virginia, which was meant the mouth of the Hudson. And they got off course. They were not where they were supposed to be. And also there were two groups aboard, those who were there for economic purposes and those who were there for religious purposes. And so in Provincetown Harbor, they said, we need to make an agreement. And the Mayflower Compact was the, of course, result of that need, and was signed by the men. Sorry about that. But in any case, it was signed and is considered to be a document of self-government. Here we are, we're 3,000 miles from the mother country, and we need to have an agreement among us. So some people say, really, that was sort of the seeds of the beginning of separation from the mother country. You can disagree with that, but I think it's an interesting point of discussion. And the first chapter in the book is called The Antecedents of the Revolution, and raises this question that there were several other key points well before 1760 that you could say were pre-revolutionary in thought. So now we have to look at the Acts of Parliament. And I've always found that this is an impressive list because it shows the cumulative effect of legislation by the mother country, which then built and built and built to what we would call an explosion at the end. And let's just look at these. And this is a pretty comprehensive list of what Parliament was doing. Well, we have to go back to the 1760s in order to really get a grasp of it. Here were the 7 Years' War, which that's was called that by the British, or what we call the French and Indian Wars, where that war went along as a means of defending the British colony from the encroachment of the French and of some Indian tribes who joined the French. Others, of course, joined the British, and that went on for many years. But was beginning to conclude in 61, and it finally ended in 63. What happened here was, of course, that Britain successfully defended this land that was west of the colonies, but they had also at the same time run up a big national debt. And so they said, we've got to recover that money, and the colonies are a fruitful source of additional revenue, and so they began to enact a series of acts. And we have 61, the writs of assistance, which was the first big piece of legislation just even before the end of those wars. And writs of assistance were search warrants that were imposed by the British government to inspect navigation and trade kinds of things. And this was the first time that there was really this kind of interference. James Otis Jr. of Barnstable Village gave a fiery speech in Boston, and I have a painting of that to show you in a few minutes, in which he said, this is absolutely unfair, and it brings up the concept, which he is partly credited with inventing, that no taxation without representation, because there was no representation of the colonies in Parliament. And so that is considered to be one of the direct beginnings of revolutionary thought. And then we have the end of the wars, and then we have the Sugar Act, and you can guess what that was a tax on. And followed a year later in 65 by the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act required a tax to be paid on every use of paper that was made, whether it was a mortgage or a deed or a letter. Think about that. If you had to pay a tax every time you used a piece of paper, and paper, of course, was very scarce in the colonies, and so it was pretty easy to collect that tax. Well, there was a huge hue and cry about that. And so a year later, the Parliament said, all right, we'll repeal the Stamp Act, but we're going to add something more. And what they added was the Declaratory Act, which was even worse. Now they said, our taxation rates of the colonies is going to be the same as it is in Britain. And that was a big increase. You can imagine how that began to add to people and their attitudes toward the mother country. Only a year later, a Parliament member named Townsend got another act through Congress, and this was taxes on china, glass, tea, lead, paper, and paint, but the big one was tea. And of course, tea was a very well-used kind of drink throughout that period and even today. So now you can see we're halfway through the decade, and things are beginning to, you might say, pile up. In 1770, we have the Boston Massacre. It's not clear who fired first. Some people think it was a patriot who fired first. They arrested a British soldier, and he was tried. And John Adams actually successfully defended him from prosecution. Finally, later that year, Parliament said, all right, we'll roll back the Townsend Act, except for tea. So then 2 years later began the process that really more formally began the move toward independence. And that's called committees of correspondence. There was one in each colony, but the first one was in Boston. And a committee of correspondence is a group that gets together to discuss their grievances against the crown. So there was some formal discussion here, and that began to build. Only a year later was the Tea Party, with, of course, a number of patriots dressed as Indians and throwing tea overboard. We don't think that there were any Cape Codders in that group, but research is still going on about that in the Tea Party that occurred later in 73. Then one final blow was the Coercive Acts in 74, which of course was a British reaction to the Boston Tea Party. And it was particularly directed at Massachusetts for that reason. And it said several things, and three of them are on your slide. First of all, you guys in the colonies don't appoint your governors and your leaders anymore. We're doing that. Secondly, we're closing the port of Boston. Too much uncontrolled trade going on there. And then the third thing that really rankled people is they said, and we're stationing an army. And by the way, you all have to quarter British troops in your house. So think about that for a minute. You living in a house in Boston is probably not very big, and you are ordered to give a room or two to a British soldier who is stationed in Boston. That really, you could say, hit home, no pun intended, for the colonials. So in 75, of course, we have the Lexington and Concord event. And in reaction to that, Parliament passed a prohibitory act, and that is in October of that year. And that was prohibiting all trade among the New England colonies. So the economic hammer came down hard. So if you look at that list, then, and you can think of the cumulative effect, it's pretty clear that something was going to happen and that things were had reached the breaking point. By the way, in 74, the Coercive Acts, that was the name that Parliament gave to it. The colonials called it the Intolerable Acts. And that, I guess, gives you the message about their feelings toward it. You may have questions about any of this, and I would be very happy to entertain the questions at the end. If you'd like to put questions in the chat box, we'll have time for that. Going back to the Stamp Act for a minute, we're back here with John Adams, and he kept a diary in 1765 before he started the correspondence later with Jefferson. And he is looking at the Stamp Act and referring to it as that enormous engine fabricated by the British Parliament, battering down all the rights and liberties of America. I mean, the Stamp Act has raised and spread through the whole continent the spirit that we recorded to our honor with all future generations. So he is really very much raising the idea of not necessarily rebellion, but something that is not to be tolerated from Parliament. In every colony, from Georgia to New Hampshire, inclusively, the stamp distributors and inspectors have been compelled by the unconquerable rage of the people to renounce their offices. So this is occurring after the big protests to the Stamp Act, and therefore resulted in the repeal of the Stamp Act. But of course, then at the same time, the Declaratory Act came down from Parliament, which was even worse. So it is interesting to look at the thought and the words of people of the time. And well, let's come back to Cape Cod directly. The Otis family of Barnstable Very important. They had emigrated from North Devon in England to Hingham originally, and then came down to Cape Cod. And there are three figures here. James Otis Sr., who was the appointed judge of the Court of Common Pleas in Barnstable Village, and he was appointed by the Crown. Then he had two children, James Jr., who his sister Mercy called Jemmy, and his sister Mercy, who married Dr. James Warren. Now, each of these people is important in their own way. James Otis Sr., as a judge, played an important role that I will talk about in a few minutes in Barnstable and on Cape Cod. But I'd like to talk next about James Otis Jr. We've already referred to him as having made that fiery speech in 1761. The next slide will show you him in action. This is a painting that was done at the time, and John Adams said, and American independence was then and there born, February of 1761. James Otis Jr. Is referred to by John Adams as contributing heavily in the decade from 1760 to 70. Never known a man whose love of country was more ardent and severe, or whose services for any 10 years of his life were so important and essential to the cause of this country. Well, why does it end in 1770, you might wonder? And some of us know that an incident happened in a pub in Boston where James Otis Jr. was speaking out against the British Crown, and a loyalist was arguing with him, a violent argument, and a loyalist struck him on the head with his cane. And James Otis Jr. was never right thereafter mentally. And some people say that he was going into mental decline anyway, but I'm sure that the being struck in the skull with a cane precipitated that in some way. The story ends kind of strangely and sadly for him. In his mental decline, he said that he would like to die by a bolt of lightning. And in fact, later in his life, he deliberately stood in the doorway of a house during a thunderstorm and was struck and killed by lightning. So he got his aim. His sister Mercy, remembering that women at that time did not have access to a fine education, but she was witnessing that James Otis Jr., her brother, was getting a fine education, and she asked to have the same. And she became a very well-educated woman and wrote treatises about the revolution that were published. And so she is also part of the intellectual tradition. But we'll come back to Colonel James Otis Sr. A little bit later. This is on the right-hand side, the copy of the front page of one of her treatises in 1805. And you can see this is it's a very learned publication. And you know that, of course, the statues of James Jr. and Mercy are both outside the Barnstable County Courthouse right in the middle of Barnstable Village, as they well should be. And so that's a very clear Cape Cod connection with the revolution through the Otis family. Another aspect of revolutionary feeling were the construction of liberty poles. And we know that they existed at least in Sandwich, Yarmouth, and on the Vineyard. And a liberty pole was basically a flagpole that had a flag on top of it. And you can see this painting has the Liberty flag on it. And it became a rallying point in a village for people who were thinking that we need to be free of the mother country. This next slide shows is a drawing of three women on the Vineyard protecting the Liberty pole because the British didn't like that and wanted to take them down because, of course, it was a psychological rallying point. There's a story that goes with the one on the vineyard. I was just on the vineyard 2 days ago and actually saw this myself. A British sea captain, captain of a British warship, came into the harbor in what we would call Vineyard Haven today, and reported that his mast needed to be replaced. It had broken off. And he said, I want to take that Liberty pole. It's just the right size and shape, and I'm going to replace the mast of my ship with the Liberty pole. Well, the vineyarders were very upset about that for, of course, the understandable reasons. And you'll see a tool at the base of the Liberty pole in that drawing. And the story is that three young women at night decided that they were going to prevent the British captain from getting this pole for a new mast. They drilled holes in the base of the Liberty pole and filled it with gunpowder, and then lit it, and it, of course, blew up and was just basically splintered. And so they successfully prevented the British captain from having a replacement mast. Today, there is a replacement pole in kind of citation or memory of this. Of course, it's a modern pole, and it isn't the right height because the height regulations in Tisbury require that it have only a maximum height. So if you go there, you can see it. It's the right width, and there's a plaque on it, but it's only about 2/3 of the true height of the original Liberty pole. So that's a different aspect of revolutionary thought. We all know, of course, about how important tea was, and there was a group of ships that continually brought tea to Boston, and the British government was tied in very closely, you might even say corruptly, with the British East India Company. And the British East India Company was not pleased when things didn't go well for their tea. Well, they British kept supplying tea to Boston, and in this particular year, I think it was 78, they 7 ships set off from England to come westward to deliver tea. 3 of them went elsewhere, including the Caribbean, and 4 were set to go to Boston. But only 3 made it. Why? Because the 4th one, the William, foundered on, guess where? The Peaked Hill Bars of Truro. And that was an interesting event because now the Patriots have a whole lot of British tea that has fallen into their hands. And you can see in this painting the ship, of course, foundering and on the shoals, and people trying to retrieve the tea. And it presented an interesting dilemma. What are we going to do with all this tea? We could drink it, we could sell it, we could destroy it, or we could return it. And actually, a little of each of those is actually what happened, although a good portion of it was actually returned. But this is an interesting incident that shows how central tea was to it, but the ship William never made it to Boston. What about Nantucket? Nantucket is an entirely different story when it comes to the Revolution. First of all, you have a strong Quaker presence there who are against war and conflict. You have Quaker merchants who were dealing whaling oil to England and getting flour and other things in return. Business was great. Why should they join a revolution? It would be shooting themselves in the foot. And so there was a very strong loyalist presence on Nantucket. Of course, there were patriots as well, but it was truly a divided island through a good part of the war. And that is something that's an entirely different story from Martha's Vineyard and, of course, from Cape Cod as well. Here we have the Vineyard and the Elizabeth Islands. We're going to come back to this map for discussing one of the incidents that occurred, but I just want to review for us. Elizabeth Islands, of course, is a chain that goes southwest from Falmouth, and this island chain was a favorite anchorage for the British fleet in this region. In particular, Norshorn Island, the biggest of the islands, you can see there that there is a significant inlet on the south side that's called Tarpaulin Cove, and that's part of the story I'm going to tell you in a few minutes. But this became a jumping off point for them to also conduct raids for food and meat that we'll talk also about. And so that is an important piece of the geography of our region in the Revolutionary period as well. Well, let's go to the second period of 74 to mid-76. And these are some of the events that occurred, and we'll be talking about each of these. I'm going to just pick a couple out before we go forward. And one of those is the fourth bullet about Harwich. Now, when the Continental Congress, the second one, passed the Declaration of Independence that was finally signed by representatives of all 13 colonies, the colonies then individually said, well, we need to poll the towns in our colony to make sure that they're in favor. And so the Massachusetts General Court, which is the name for our legislature and still is, said we're going to poll the towns in Massachusetts to see how they feel about independence. And Barnstable first voted no. Why would that be? Well, let's look at the economics and the demography of Barnstable in 1776. You have, again, a lot of merchants who are doing very well economically, trading back and forth with England, as well as you have a strong patriot presence. And so it took 2 votes for Barnstable to join. Harwich, on the other hand, was the first Cape town to vote for independence. And that's kind of an interesting chronology, and we could speculate as to why that was. And those of us who are on here from Harwich maybe could give us some ideas about that. But I mention these because it shows it was sometimes a mixed reaction, that the Loyalists had very strong presence throughout the Revolutionary period. The other thing I'll mention about is the last one there before we go into any further detail, and that was something that involved not Cape Cod directly, but it was definitely Massachusetts. In the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga, the one that the Patriots won, they captured a number of cannon, and they dragged them all the way across the state of Massachusetts from the Hudson to Boston in the winter using oxen and sledges. And they mounted those cannon on Dorchester Heights, pointing down toward the British who were occupying Boston. And it was at that point that the British said, I think we're going to leave. And that, of course, is celebrated in March 17th, called Evacuation Day, which happens to be St. Patrick's Day, too. I'll talk about the other things as we go forward, but this is just a quick overview of this second period in the book. Well, here we are with the familiar building in Barnstable Village that's called the Tales of Cape Cod today, but it is the building that was the old colonial courthouse, the Court of Common Pleas. And that is where Colonel James Otis Sr. was the judge. And the protesters, or we would sometimes call them later on the Patriots, a group of them approached Colonel Otis and said, even though you're appointed by the crown, we're going to close this court. Now, just think about the dilemma that this puts on a man of his stature, and he was highly respected. Here is a man who has been appointed by the British Crown to be a judge in this colony, and now you've got these group of rabble-rousers who are asking you to step down, but you're now a ensconced resident of this colony of Massachusetts, and how do you feel about this? And so protesters approached him saying that they're going to close the court. And they said to him directly, "Sir, you have done your duty, and now we must do ours." And so Colonel Otis actually voluntarily stepped down. And that act was very important because it was a man in a prestigious position who, by stepping down, basically said that he was, in a sense, in favor of revolution. He didn't explicitly say that, but that's what the action communicated by stepping aside. On the other hand, some of our patriot ancestors were not very well behaved. One of the shameful incidents was that they tarred and feathered a loyalist woman in Barnstable Village named Abby Freeman. Think for a minute about what it would be like to have hot pine tar poured all over your body, and then have feathers thrown at it, and then being ridden on a rail through the village while people are jeering you. Pretty bad. And that, of course, was a practice at the time, which we would call today public shaming. So we have to acknowledge these things as well. Did Cape Cod have any connection with Lexington and Concord? The answer is yes, but only indirectly. And this is not terribly well known, but let me give you the story. In Marshfield, which is about halfway between Cape Cod and Boston, there was a British garrison that was stationed there to keep an eye on the colony. And in response to that, a group of patriot militia were stationed nearby to keep an eye on the British. Well, when April of 1775 came along, a word went out that the militia were going to be needed in Lexington and Concord, perhaps, because it looked like the British were going to try to recapture the storehouse of British ammunition that was located in Lexington and Concord, in Concord specifically. And so the militia was drawn back up to Lexington. Well, that meant that now there was a vacuum there. And so the word came down, we need Cape Cod's militia to step up and go and replace the Marshfield militia to continue keeping an eye on that British garrison. And so a group of militia from Sandwich and Barnstable and Yarmouth began to march toward Marshfield. Then the word came down, probably by a horseback rider, that, oh, the British have also left. They're now apparently gone to Lexington also. And so there was now no longer a need for the Cape militia to replace that militia that had gone northward. And so at that point, they turned around and went back home. I should mention about the militia. The militia and this particular war, and in other wars as well, were local people who were identified as people who would defend a particular locale when needed, but that they were not full-time members of the army. So they were farmers and fishermen. But when a so-called alarm went out, and that's what they were called, that the British looked like they were going to attack someplace or conduct a raid someplace, then the militia, these people, ordinary farmers and fishermen, would mobilize into a force for 2 or 3 or 4 days and hold off, if they can, the British advance. And then when that was over, they would go back to their daily lives. And they were different then from the Continental Army, which was a full-time force that, of course, was not local. It was actually across the entire group of colonies. And that, of course, is what George Washington commanded. Then there is a subset of the militia, which are known as Minutemen, and they were especially trained militia. So they were sort of, you might say, an elite subset of the militia, and they were called upon in Lexington and Concord in particular. So just the distinction, I think, is helpful because we use these words a lot. There are two things about our book that I'm particularly pleased about, and that is that we have some new material on the participation of indigenous peoples in the revolution and also by African Americans. And this has required a lot of research and has been read for both accuracy and sensitivity by readers who are knowledgeable and members of the group. And this is something that is, we think, quite new in terms of the detail that's provided. And so the Wampanoag group of indigenous people in Mashpee and the Vineyard and all of southeastern Massachusetts began to join the Continental Army. And I have a question for you. Of all the Cape towns which were given the opportunity to ask people to step up and join the Continental Army, Mashpee had the highest percentage of men who stepped up. Not the highest number, but the highest percentage of any of the Cape Cod towns. And I wonder if anybody can guess a reason why that might have been. Gordon? Oh, I thought you had your hand up. I guess I can't see everybody, so all right.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think that was the location for the majority of the Wampanoag tribes.
That is correct. That's true. Why would the Wampanoag have been interested in stepping up at the highest percentage to join the Continental Army? And the answer is, well, if you look at the history of what happened from the earliest arrival of the white man, that they had lost a lot of territory and that they viewed the opportunity of joining the Continental Army as a possible way of regaining some of the land that they had lost. So, of course, it didn't work out that way for them, but that is a fact that has been shown. In any case, Mashpee has done a wonderful job of memorializing their participation in the revolutionary cause. There's a very new exhibit in Mashpee Center on the green there with beautifully carved stones, each to an individual Wampanoag person who served in the revolution. So that's something that's very interesting to see. And we know from research now that there are at least 24 African Americans from Cape Cod who are documented as having served. We think there are more than that. We had the good fortune of having a member of our committee was a former staff member at the CIA, and of course the CIA is very good at collecting information, and so his work has resulted in this. And there were 24 that have joined the Army that we know for sure, and 6 that were on privateers, which I haven't talked about yet. But I think this is an open-ended thing, and there's more research to be conducted, and I fully expect that we will find more as time goes on. Many of these people, of course, were freed slaves. And these days, we're learning a lot more than we knew in the past, just as recently as 5 years ago, about slavery in the North. And that is a whole separate chapter, of course, in history. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the vineyard. Obviously, as an island, it is tied to the sea very closely. There were significant numbers of loyalists on Martha's Vineyard, but not to the percentage on Nantucket. And of course, there were many patriots, and I've already talked about the Liberty Pole that was on the vineyard. But privateering also was an important kind of pursuit. And just to review, privateering involves basically what you might call legalized piracy. If you have a ship that's equipped with men and equipment, and of course, I'm including cannon in that, you can apply for a letter of marque, M-A-R-Q-U-E, from your government. And if you receive that as an approval, then you are allowed to conduct military raids on other shipping. And some of the revenue that you collect has to go to the colony, but you can keep a certain proportion too. And so privateering was a big pursuit in the areas around the vineyard and into the Atlantic as well against British shipping. And the British engaged in privateering also. So I'm going to just advance the slide to this painting, which is of two privateers going at it for each other. You see the one on the right has the Union Jack, and the one on the left has a Patriot flag. This was right at the end of the war, but that's the kind of thing that it was engaged in. So obviously, also, the Martha's Vineyard being an island, it was very subject to being raided by the British for food and meat, which we'll come to in more detail a little bit later. And we have the third period, which is, of course, we all know about the terrible winter of 1777 in Valley Forge. That was, however, a very important turning point for the Continental Army. That was the time when Baron von Steuben, from Prussian general or Prussian officer, was brought to join the Continental Army, and he really shaped them up. He had them practice to get a high skill level of loading muskets and firing muskets and formations and responding to appropriate discipline and the like. So as a result of his presence at Valley Forge, the army that left Valley Forge at the end of that winter was much better qualified in terms of the preparation for battle. Well, George Washington, as I said, ordered the survey for the Cape Cod Canal during this time period. I'd love to see the documents that were reported from the Army, but I have not had access to that. This is also when British Admiral Grey conducted a lot of raids on the vineyard in 78, and now a big and important shipwreck, another one, off of Provincetown, and that goes along with the wreck of the William that we talked about earlier. Of course, in historical time, there's several thousand ships have foundered on those shoals off of Provincetown and Truro, but we've only selected these two as having an impact on the Revolution. So another important factor in this time period is the presence of smallpox. And this is the time period when they were just beginning to talk about immunization. And there was a technique of immunization. This is a not very pleasant topic, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Um, the technique was to take the scab from a smallpox victim who was recovering and place it on an open wound in a person you wanted to immunize. And there was just enough of the smallpox germ in that method to immunize that person that then prevented them from getting the disease. Now, I have to say that this didn't always work, and sometimes the person who was being immunized actually did get the smallpox and may have died from it. But George Washington, to his credit, knew that he would probably lose many more men to smallpox than he would to British guns, and so he initiated the inoculation or the immunization of a great many of his troops that way and saved them. And that has nothing to do specifically with Cape Cod, but I think it's a factor that we have to consider because, of course, smallpox was a big scourge on Cape and Islands as well. And we've probably all seen these small cemeteries where people were buried with just a very few other people because there was fear that they should not be put in a larger cemetery. There would be more communicability of the disease, and so they were isolated when they were buried. So that becomes something that is non-military, but obviously a factor in this time period. Well, now we have the second big shipwreck. That's a picture of a sister ship of the Somerset, the Agamemnon. The Somerset looked just like that. And I'd like you to think back to your seventh grade English teacher who had you read The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere by Longfellow. And in the something like the eighth stanza of that poem, Longfellow talks about Paul Revere rowing silently with muffled oars across the Charles River to the other side under the looming shadow of the Somerset. When Paul Revere was, after the two lanterns had been hung, was rowing across the river to the other side to start his horseback ride, he had to go very quietly. And the Somerset was a big ship that was stationed in Boston Harbor and basically was used for not only as a troop ship, but also for cargo. So an enormous ship, as you can see, with three rows of guns and cannon and so on. Well, in 1778, in August, the Somerset was on its way from the south to try to intercept the French fleet who were on their way to Boston to relieve the Patriots. And of course, we know that the final success in the Revolutionary War by the Patriots was due in no small way to the participation of the French. Well, that didn't work out for the Somerset. It got caught in a storm and then could not get off the shoals and wrecked in Truro off of Peaked Hill bars. This was an interesting event because not many men drowned as a result of that, but 450 were captured by a small group of patriots, and then they were marched from Truro to Boston on foot. And it took at least apparently about a week to get there. When they got to Boston, they had probably not more than 300 and some, because some had died, some had drifted off, and so on. But they were later used in prisoner exchanges, prisoner of war exchanges between the two sides in the war. So that's an amazing accomplishment by a small group of patriots. And of course, the marching all the way to Boston is a feat in itself. There's some myths around the Somerset. And you may read in some 19th century writings that the Somerset was stationed in Provincetown, and the doctor on board the ship came ashore and married a local woman, and so on and so on and so on. About 30 years ago, a local historian said, I'm going to check that. And she found that that was absolutely false, and that she was able to document that the Somerset was not near Provincetown Harbor at all. It was in the ocean heading to intercept the French fleet. But the Somerset story doesn't quite end there for Cape Cod. I'll talk about that in a minute, but just as an interesting side point, every once in a while, every so many years, the ocean washes away the sand from the wreck, and then it covers it up again and washes it away and covers it up. This is a photograph from, I think, the late 19th century, when the bones of the Somerset had reappeared. And you can see it's an enormous ship, and it's very obvious that it's still there. The most recent appearance was somewhere around 2007, and there is a photograph there that's showing part of the ship still there, and a national park ranger, because you're not supposed to take your jackknife and take off a piece of the wood. It is now an archaeologically protected wreck, and so just look at it, don't take any. If it happens to appear the next time that you happen to be on the beach. But it is covered up now again at the moment. Well, salt was terribly important in this period as a means of food preservation, because of course there was not refrigeration, and salt then was essential to have for any kind of settled life. The British had destroyed the Cape Salt Works because they knew how important it was to the livelihood of Cape Codders. And the methodology, of course, in the salt industry was the kind of thing where you would carve out pieces, sections of land, and pump seawater into it. Then the seawater is allowed to evaporate, and what's left is the salt. Of course, you have to cover it over when it rains so that it won't dilute the salt. Well, the British had destroyed that, but the wreck of the Somerset saved the day. John Sears of Dennis came along and restarted the salt works by taking the bilge pump, the Somerset, which is, of course, a huge piece of equipment because it was a huge ship, and used it to restart the salt industry by, again, pumping seawater into these pans, which then allowed the salt industry to restart. That photograph, of course, is not from colonial times, because photography wasn't invented until 1839, but it is a 19th century view, and it does show the workers raking the salt and so on. And so that was an unexpected bonus of the Somerset wreck for the livelihoods of Cape Codders. Well, the last thing I want to talk about is the Battle of Falmouth. Now, when you look up Battle of Falmouth, Massachusetts on Google, you will find not one, but two entries, one for 1775 and one for 1779. I knew about the one on 1779, but I said, what? 1775? Falmouth, Massachusetts battle? What is that? And it turns out it was a minor battle, but I said, Falmouth, Massachusetts? And then I remembered that Maine was part of Massachusetts until 1820. And so the Battle of Falmouth, Massachusetts in 1775 took place near Portland, Maine, in what is now today still called Falmouth, Maine. And so that's not the one we're interested in. We're interested in the one in 1779. So to review the situation, British had been raiding Cape and Islands, particularly the Vineyard and the Falmouth area, slaughtering cattle for meat, stealing other food, and generally harassing the population. And so at one point, Colonel Dimmick of the militia that was located in the Falmouth area said, "Oh, we need to get back at the British." And so he conducted a counter raid on the British troops as they were trying to collect food. And that made the British really mad. And so they planned a retaliation against Falmouth. And I'll talk about that in a moment, but this is a painting that's in the Woods Hole Library showing boatloads of British soldiers who are in the process of slaughtering cattle and, of course, taking the meat. Of course, all invading armies in all wars have the problem of a overstretched supply line. These people, of course, were 3,000 miles from home. They had to have other sources. And so I'm not excusing it, but I'm explaining it, that we shouldn't be surprised that that was conducted. So in retaliation, the British said, well, we're going to burn Falmouth. There were 10 ships that were anchored in Tarpaulin Cove. That's a picture of the cove in modern times. I imagine that some of us on the Zoom today have experienced Tarpaulin Cove on a sailboat. I spent a very rocky night there on a sailboat in 1970 that's open to the southwest winds, but it's a great shelter if you're have good conditions. And of course, it was a fantastic shelter for the British fleet. And so these 10 ships are moored, or I should say anchored, in Tarpaulin Cove, and they began their plan. And on the evening of April 2nd in 79, a loyalist homeowner on the island next door, Pasque Island, was entertaining some British officers. And you've all heard the phrase, loose lips sink ships. Of course, that was a big phrase during World War II. Well, this is an example of it also. Even though he was a loyalist, John Slocum, when he overheard the British officers discussing, we're going to burn Falmouth tomorrow, he thought, those poor people of Falmouth are defenseless. They've got to be warned. And so, aside from being a loyalist, he sent his 9-year-old son, Asa Slocum, to row 4 miles in the dark from Pasque Island all the way back to Woods Hole and to warn the Falmouth militia that something was going to happen the next day. There is a young people's book that has been written about this event, and the cover is showing on your screen now. The book is called Night Raiders Along the Cape, and there's Asa Slocum rowing away and a British ship in the background. I've had nothing but admiration for somebody who could do that at that age with no GPS. I did do a little research to find out the phases of the moon at that time. And on the night of April 2nd in 1779, the moon was 2 days after full. So if the weather was good, it is likely that he probably had some light to use when he rode. He could have maybe seen the outlines of the islands. But in any case, it's a pretty significant achievement. And he made it. He got to Woods Hole. He went to the home of a friend, and his friend's parents alerted the militia in time. So 220 militia responded to this alarm. Now, I need to tell you that before this happened, the militia, in preparation for possible British raids, had built up sand entrenchments on the beach all along what today is Surf Drive in Falmouth. If you are familiar with that, or if you'd like to drive by, it's a long stretch of a very nice beach. And these sand entrenchments was a continuous row of sand that was about 4 feet high enough for a man to crouch behind with a musket and not be seen from the sea. And so they reinforced these sand entrenchments at night, and then they got ready. And this is a painting that's in the Falmouth Historical Society showing the British ships in the background, the boats from the British ships getting ready to raid, jumping into the water and coming ashore, and all the militia crouched behind the sand entrenchments with their muskets at the ready position. This is another painting of the same incident from a different perspective. And this painting is in the Falmouth Town Hall lobby. I'm very proud of this, actually. So what happened? Well, so 200 British soldiers jumped in the water and were wading toward the shore to set fire to Falmouth. When they were in the water and therefore vulnerable, then the Minutemen rose up and fired 2 volleys. It takes 20 seconds to reload, by the way, an 18th century musket. But they fired 2 volleys from the entrenchments, surprising the British completely, killed 15 and wounded 20. And the British said, they thought this was not a very good idea after all. And they went back to their boats and back to their ships. That was in the morning. In the afternoon, the British began to do what they wanted to do from a distance, namely firing incendiary bombs from their ships. And the incendiary bombs were designed to bounce and bounce and bounce until they hit a structure and then burst into flames. If they had succeeded, Falmouth would have been burned to the ground. But let's talk about when this was. It's April 3rd now. There's been a winter. The ground is just beginning to thaw. And so many of these cannons, these incendiary cannonballs, hit the ground and just went thud and didn't move. And so Falmouth ended up being saved. And that then made them, the British made a decision that they would sail elsewhere. And they went to the island of the Elizabeth Chain that is the nearest, Nonamesset, and then went on to the Vineyard, and then ultimately to Nantucket to protect the loyal refugees there. In other words, the loyalists were in need of being protected from this rising patriot group. So that's the story of the Battle of Falmouth in 1779. I had an ancestor who fought in that battle. He was a member of the Falmouth militia, and this is his gravestone in Old Burying Ground in Falmouth. Of course, we had a ceremony celebrating his service, and he was a fifer. He was 16 years old, and he, as a fifer in 18th century warfare, fifers didn't just play music. They, like drummers, would blow signals such as advance or retreat. He later served in the War of 1812 as an adult. So the war winds down in 81 and Cornwallis surrenders, and there were Cape Cod men who witnessed that very important historical event because they were members of the Continental Army. And then we have it took 2 years to get the Treaty of Paris signed in 83, and there was a slow economic recovery in our region. And a lot of the loyalists emigrated to Canada, understandably. And then, of course, the Constitution in 87. And then the War of 1812 starts all over. Of course, that was for different reasons, but that is the conclusion of this little chronology. And I have this information that I could send to anyone if you want it. And that is, if you're interested in tracking down a Revolutionary War ancestor, there's a process for joining the Sons of the American Revolution. We have an active chapter on Cape Cod. And lastly is the book itself. And I'm holding up a copy of the cover of the book, as you can see. It's a illustrated, about 200 pages, and it covers many of these things that I talked about, or all of them, plus a lot more. If you're interested, it can be obtained at Titcomb's bookstore or the shop at the Falmouth Historical Society or the Brewster bookstore. I can also mail you a copy. And if you would like me to do that, I'll just invite you to use my email address, which is at the bottom, David Martin, DR like doctor, at AOL.com, and I can mail you the book. It would be $30, and you would send a check made out to MMHS, Marston's Mills Historical Society, which is the sponsor of the grant we got. And so you can let me know if you'd like to purchase the book that way, or as I say, you could go to any of those three stores and buy it as well. So at this point, I'll be very happy to answer questions or get your comments on any of this as well. I don't see any chat box at the moment.
I do see one from
Okay.
saying didn't Mercy Otis
Gene, you muted yourself. Yeah, I can't hear you, Gene.
Okay, there are chat questions in the chat showing up.
All right.
If you if
go ahead.
double click on your
I keep losing you.
okay, here we go.
Yeah.
Someone says, I'm curious about privateers. If both colonists and British participated, who administered, issued marques, and collected
Leonard
revenue?
Mark, yes. That's an interesting question. The government of the colony where the ship was going out of would have given the letter of marque for the Patriot privateer ships, and of course the British government would have given the letter of marque to those who were privateering for the British cause. Yes.
Are there records listing names of the Cape Cod militia?
Yes, there are. The what's considered to be a definitive source is the 17-volume set called Soldiers and Sailors of the American Revolution, which is available on the shelf at Sturgis Library, but it's also online. And that has a listing of patriots who were active and recorded and who applied for pensions throughout the colonies, but in this case, it's only Massachusetts. And so it's a huge work, but it is alphabetically listed by town. And so if you go to Soldiers and Sailors of the Revolution, and you can access it online that way and look up names. It is not completely comprehensive, because if a person was in the army or the militia and didn't apply for a pension or didn't, then they wouldn't be listed there. But that would cover the majority.
Here's another question. Didn't Mercy Otis Warren contribute to the idea of individual rights leading to the Bill of Rights?
Yes, yes. Thank you very much for saying that. That's absolutely right. And we owe a good portion of appreciation to her for what we ended up with as the Bill of Rights, which of course perfected the Constitution for things that the Constitution failed to address or inadequately address. Good.
And another question is, militia would have been both loyalists and patriots, correct?
No, I'm sorry. No, they were just patriot. They were local people in a particular region, maybe 2 or 3 towns adjacent to each other, who agreed to be called up, and they were ultimately paid for their service. Not very well, but they were paid for the time that they served in any kind of so-called alarm or action. But then they went back to their regular livelihood in between. So they were not therefore members of the regular Continental Army who were uh, uh, paid for that whole time.
That's all I see in the chat. If anybody has a question, if they could raise their electronic hand, we can see it, you'd come to the top. Otherwise, we'll give it a minute. No, I don't see anybody putting up their electronic hands. This recording will be available on the ALL website and YouTube channel, so that will come in the future, so you can tell people about it. And the information for purchasing the book will also be in the newsletter.
Very good. I will add one more thing. If you purchase the book through either of those 3 bookstores, then you would your transaction would be to them. That note I have about check to MMHS, it would only apply when you're ordering it directly. But if you just email me at David Martin Dr., I can explain that further. Be glad to do it. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. It was excellent.
Oh, thank you, David. That was wonderful.
Thank you. It was very, very good. Very informative. I enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you.